This bike, the Honda Africa Twin, it's one of the most legendary names in adventure motorcycling. When Honda released the revised Africa Twin based on a 1000cc parallel twin back in 2016, it was met with almost universal acclaim from journalists around the world. I liked it so much that I ended up buying one myself, which I ended up then selling a couple years later, and just recently, because I liked the Africa Twin platform so much, I bought a 2016 model. In 2020, Honda revised the Africa Twin, increasing the engine size, updating the electronics, updating the dashboard, and doing a host of other changes. The big question is, in an increasingly crowded adventure bike segment, does the Africa Twin still offer enough for the money to justify buying it over the competition? Perhaps one big potential issue with the Africa Twin is that it falls very much in between the larger, more touring-oriented bikes like BMW's 1250 GS, the KTM 1290, Yamaha Super Tenere 1200, and others of that size. In between there and the smaller, more off-road focused bikes like Yamaha's Tenere 700, KTM 790 and 890 Adventures, and even the new Aprilia Touareg 660. So the question becomes, does it take the best from both of those worlds? Or maybe it takes the worst from both of those worlds, but that's what we need to find out today. I've been fortunate enough, and thank you to Honda for allowing me to do this, to spend the last month riding this bike extensively on and off-road and really testing out everything that it offers. I have enough riding experience on this bike now, not only to compare it to the older 1000cc model in case you're thinking of upgrading, but also to really offer some comparisons to the other adventure bikes in this price range. Since this revised 1100cc version has been out for over a year now, and I'm one of the last journalists to get to the party, I'm not going to go into all the specs and details in this review because you can look those up easily elsewhere. But it is important to understand that the Africa Twin comes in the standard bike and also the adventure sports version, and it's very important to understand the key differences between the two bikes. So please excuse me for reading off my phone a little bit here, but I want to get this right in comparing the key differences between the adventure sports and the base model you see here. So the differences break down like this. The first big thing is the difference in the fuel tank size. So on the standard bike, you get a 5-gallon or 19-liter fuel tank. If you go to the Adventure Sports, it's 6.5 gallons or 25 liters on that model. The windshield's also different. So the base bike, you get the small rally-style windshield. On the Adventure Sports bike, you get the larger adjustable touring windshield. The other thing, which is a downside of this base model, is they took off the grab handles and a luggage rack. If you remember the 1000cc Africa Twin, they all came with a luggage rack and grab handles. Not having those is a huge downside, and we'll talk about that later. The Adventure Sports version gives you all that stuff. There's some other very key things that the Adventure Sports version adds to this base bike. So let's run through those now. So heated grips, you get those on the Adventure Sports, an accessory socket for power, cornering lights, which light up, when you're going around corners at night. Tubeless rims, so this bike has spoked rims with tubes in them. But the most notable difference, and probably the biggest thing on the price increase that justifies the price increase, is Showa's electronically adjustable suspension on the Adventure Sports bike, which this bike doesn't have. This bike does have, however, adjustments, but they're just manual, not electronic. The Adventure Sports version is $2,800 US more expensive than the base bike. And it's also 29 pounds or about 13 kilograms heavier. Honda intends that this base model bike be more for the off-road focused rider and the Adventure Sports version be more for touring-oriented riders. However, the Adventure Sports version is still very off-road capable, just like this one is. They both have the same ground clearance at 9.8 inches and the same suspension travel at 8.7 inches on both ends. So DCT, yes, this bike is a DCT. Now this is not a video about the DCT transmission. I have that video that came out a few days ago, so go watch that video, and we're not going to go through that here because this video would be too long. So it's a dedicated video talking about the ups and downs of a DCT transmission. But what you need to know about the DCT is that it adds $800 to the price of either model, and it also adds about 23 pounds or about 10 kilograms weight penalty to the bike. And that is noticeable and substantial on a bike of this weight. So let's talk about street riding. How does this bike perform on the street, whether we're talking about twisties or two-lane highway or freeway riding? Well, one thing I will tell you right away is that it's a big improvement from the 1000cc version sold between 2016 and 2019, and here's why. They've changed the suspension geometry and the suspension settings a bit, and they revised the chassis. So the old bike, as some of the reviewers noted, including myself, the 1000cc bike was kind of vague and didn't want to corner that well on the pavement. They fixed that with a new bike. It's very nimble, it's very playful, it's very confidence inspiring on the street, and it makes for a great ride on pavement. Let's talk about the increase in power. So it's noticeable right away. It feels like a big boost in power and torque. Oh man, this new engine is sweet. Oh, this is so much better than my 1000. Handling is superb on this, way better than my bike. Honda is only saying it's around a 10 horsepower increase and maybe a 10 foot-pound increase. It feels like more than that. This engine feels pretty lively and pretty punchy, which is great because the 1000cc bike, although I love it and I have one in the garage, it does feel a little bit pokey at times. Let's talk about a few other things. So the brakes on this bike work very, very well. They're very strong, they're very confidence inspiring. They're also very linear and progressive, so they're easy to modulate. So like I mentioned, the standard bike has this rally windscreen, so it doesn't have much wind buffeting because you get clean air, pretty clean airflow on the helmet. If you want more wind protection, you're going to be looking at putting on an aftermarket windshield or the Honda accessory shield, or going up to that Adventure Sports model if you want that bigger fairing. Let's talk about some of the comfort. So the ergonomics in terms of the handlebars, that feels really comfortable, really good position for sitting or standing. The seat, unfortunately, I found the seat to be very uncomfortable. So as opposed to the old 1000cc bike, which I've owned, that seat was pretty comfortable for a stock seat. I think they went the opposite direction. Maybe they shaved the seat down to make it lower, which this bike does feel lower to the ground than the old 1000cc bike, but they sacrificed some of the seating comfort. In my opinion, again, from what I experienced, your mileage may vary, but if you're going to tour with this bike, you might want to consider budgeting for an aftermarket seat. Let's cover a couple things that other reviews have talked about. So let's cover vibration first. Some journalists noted that they felt the bike had a lot of vibration. Well, I think what's happening is they're lugging the bike, they're chugging the engine too low, because below about 3,000 RPM, which the DCT will tend to keep you in that range if you're running in drive mode, which is why I don't like the drive mode on a DCT, but that's the other video. It'll chug the bike and you'll feel the vibration if you accelerate at those low RPMs. But if you accelerate above 3,000 RPM, the bike doesn't have any excess vibration. It shifts so much, like I'm already in 5th gear at 30 miles an hour. It's just lugging along. Boy, that is very, I don't like that at all. It does have a little bit more vibes than the 1000cc motor, I know, because I have one in the garage and I've ridden these back to back. The new motor is punchier, more powerful, but it does have a bigger pistons, and I think you do feel that a little bit more in the vibration, but it wouldn't be a problem. I wouldn't say that that'd be a reason not to consider the bike. So as we wrap up this street riding talk here, one thing that I will say is that I think when they went to the 1100cc and they made it Euro 5 compliant, what's happened is you're getting a lot more engine heat. So the old 1000 bike, I know because I have one, it doesn't have much engine heat. It runs pretty cool and you don't feel your legs getting roasted and hot. On this bike, I noticed dramatically more engine heat coming off of it. And again, that's probably just, you know, one of these issues that comes with that Euro 5 compliance, because if there's less stuff coming out the tailpipe, the heat's got to go somewhere, so it's going in the exhaust system in the engine. So that's something to keep in mind if you live in a hot climate. This bike runs a little bit hotter than the old Africa Twin did. So let's talk about how this bike performs off-road. So I was lucky to get to ride it quite a bit in off-road situations. In many ways, it reminds me of the previous model that I owned. So it's pretty stable, pretty confidence inspiring, and pretty easy and approachable to ride off-road in most situations, as long as you're not getting too crazy technical. If you want to compare it to other adventure bikes you may have ridden, it does ride and feel quite a bit smaller and lighter than something like a 1200 GS or Super Tenere 1200 or Tiger 1200 or those bigger class of bikes. But it does not feel as light or as small as a Tenere 700, a KTM 790 or 890, or that class of bike. It definitely feels larger and heavier, especially in rough terrain, than those motorcycles do. So it definitely falls in between those two categories. If you're coming from something like a KTM 950 or 990, maybe the old F800 GS, something like that, maybe the old Tiger 800 XC, I would say this is better. It handles a bit better and more natural and more stable than those bikes did, and so I think that's a great thing. So continuing my discussion of how this bike works off-road, I have to get to one huge downside, and I'm being brutally honest about this. The suspension. The suspension I found to be incredibly undersprung and incredibly soft. I think other reviewers, some have noted this, especially Brake Magazine. That guy does a great job, so shout out to you. You noticed this in your review as well. A lot of journalists have glossed over it, maybe because they're worried about Honda getting mad at them. But I'm going to tell you like it is. If you come off something like a KTM 790 or 890, even a Tenere 700, or pretty much any of the other mid-size adventure bikes, and you get on this, it is so soft off-road that you're honestly going to think something's wrong with it. Like the suspension will bottom out almost immediately when you hit any moderate impact, any sort of dip or rut at any sort of speed at all the chassis, the rest of the chassis and the motorcycle seems to be very capable of doing. The suspension blows through the stroke and bottoms out.
You could figure that out. Ow! Oh, ow! God damn it! I really hurt my back on that one. It just bottoms out, you know. I mean, again, most people aren't going to ride it like an idiot like this, and I should have been standing up for that, but oh man, the suspension will blow right through the stroke.
Yes, I did try playing with the settings. I couldn't tune that out of it. It's just undersprung. Making matters worse is that I didn't think the damping was very good either. So not only does it seem to be undersprung, but it doesn't seem to absorb chatter and things that well. I tried playing with different settings on all the clickers and all my compression and rebound damping. I couldn't really make it comfortable no matter what I did. So I think that it's an incredibly capable platform and you feel the capabilities there, but the softness of the suspension pretty much ruins the off-road experience for me. Again, this is just for me and how I ride. I tend to ride fairly aggressively and I have a lot of experience with other adventure bikes, so I kind of have some expectations coming into it, and this is just too soft. I do think if you revalved and resprung the suspension, you'd have an amazing bike. And that's why I would still consider buying one, because you can tune that out of it with a few dollars spent in the aftermarket. Now keep in mind when I talk about that, this is the standard bike. I don't have the electronic suspension version. I'm trying to get the Adventure Sports with the electronic suspension for testing very soon, and I'll report back on that. Some riders have said that because of the tunability of that, and that's a whole different system, that it's much firmer and much better, so I hope that it is, and that'd be great if it was. But as it is, this standard bike, unfortunately, I just find it to be too soft for off-road use. So if you're buying it for a lot of off-road use that you have in mind, budget for springs and maybe some valving as well. So what are the highs? What are the things I love about the revised 1100cc Africa Twin? So the first thing is Honda's build quality, which I've come to expect from them, and this bike delivers on that. Everything is finished extremely well. This bike is dirty because I've been riding it, so excuse that. But the quality of all the components seem like they would last 50 years. I mean, they really are that high quality. So that's great, and you have that expected reliability from a Honda motorcycle. Another thing I like, and this may seem shallow, but I think it does matter, looks do matter because it affects how you feel about the bike, is the styling. I think the Africa Twin is still one of the best looking adventure bikes on the road. The other thing I love about the Africa Twin is that it's kind of the perfect in-between bike. So if you find a 1250 or a 1200 to be a little bit too large, too heavy, too powerful, and just too much, but you want a little bit more on the road than like maybe the 700 Tenere or the 790 or 890 KTM provides, then this is the perfect middle ground between those two, and it really does split that difference right down the middle. So I like that about it. And also the price is very good on this. It's very competitive. So what are the things I don't like? Well, that's probably apparent by now. I've talked about a lot of them, but just to cover that, the suspension's too soft for off-roading. It just is, sorry. The other thing I don't like is they took off the rack and the grab handles from the standard bike. It feels like They kind of cheated on this because if you notice when they brought the bike out, they said, oh, the bike's lighter by 8 pounds or something like that. We've reduced the weight. Well, yeah, you reduced the weight because you took off a bunch of equipment. So that was a little bit a sleight of hand. So I don't know about that one. I'd rather have that back because you really need those grab handles to move the bike around, and there's no place to put luggage on this. Another thing I don't like is the engine heat. I talked about this. The engine does put off a lot more heat than the old one. One of the best things about the older Africa Twins, I'm talking about the 1000cc ones, not the really old Africa Twins, is that they didn't have much engine heat as compared to like a lot of the KTMs out there. This bike, unfortunately, has engine heat. I think this is something that's happening across the industry because when they go to Euro 5, they're just having to trap more of the exhaust gases in the motor and the exhaust, and so more that's transferred to the rider. So again, something that you need to keep in mind if you're going to buy this. So the final downside I want to talk about is a really big one, and it has to do with the control layout, how the buttons work and how the TFT works, and how you control different riding parameters. Now, if you watch my first ride impressions video, you know what I'm talking about here, and if you've seen some of my social media posts. Now, a lot of people rose to me on that first ride video because they said, well, you should know exactly how to work the bike before you ride it and do a review. Well, it wasn't a review. It was designed to do just that, be a first ride impressions of getting on the bike for the first time and not having memorized all 300 pages of the owner's manual when you first ride the bike, because that's realistic. That's what's going to happen. So I showed that and how when you jump on it and ride it and even play with all the controls, you can't even figure out how to do something as simple as turn off the ABS or turn off the traction control. They made it incredibly convoluted on this bike, and let me talk about this a little bit more. So the bike has different riding modes. Now, riding modes are nothing new. All modern motorcycles with electronics pretty much have that. So on the Honda, you can scroll through all these different riding modes, but tied to the riding modes are two different things. One is the settings for like traction control, ABS, wheelie control, and that sort of thing. The other thing that's tied to it, and this is what sets this bike apart, is that the dashboard layout changes in each of those modes. Now, you can change that dashboard layout by going into the menu and going into the settings. If you want to have full control over all the parameters of the bike, you can't be in one of the dashboard layouts that just shows you the simple information because it locks out your access to a lot of the different parameters. So if you want full control of everything, you're going to have to set all the riding modes to be that gold level of information, that higher level of information on the TFT. So there's really three major complaints I have about the system. One is that the TFT takes way too long to boot up when you start the bike, and we'll show that here in a second. Number two is that there's too many buttons and it's totally non-intuitive to use this. Even after a month of riding it, it's still confusing. The third issue has to do with the fact that the bike does not memorize the settings for ABS and traction control when you cycle the bike on and off, which requires you to go and wait for the TFT to boot up and go in and push all these buttons on the touchscreen every single time. Let me just cut to a video and show you why that's such a problem. So this is the perfect time and place to show you one of my main complaints about this motorcycle. So I've been doing some other videos showing people how to do U-turns and stuff out here in the dirt. Anyway, I'm turning the bike on and off a lot and getting off and on a lot. In order to do this video, I have to turn off the ABS and turn off the traction control. Well, guess what? Every time you turn the bike off, with the key anyway, if you use the kill switch, sometimes this is not an issue, but sometimes it is. So when I turn it back on, here's what happens. So I'm waiting, I've got this LCD coming up, but the settings reset. So right now my ABS and traction control are back on, but the problem is I have to wait for this. So every time I want to get going again, I don't care about this. Like, I don't want to see a safety message, you know? And then this goes away, and there's still lag. So right now, okay, it's still lagging. Maybe now I can do it. So now I have to go back in and I have to do this every single time I restart the bike. Okay, I did configure user 1 mode to be the right kind of screen so that I have access to the settings. So on the fourth tab here, I've got to go ABS cancel on a touch screen. There's no hard button to do this, okay? There's not. Would you like to cancel ABS? Well, yeah, of course. That's what I just said. So now finally my rear ABS is off. My front ABS is still on though. Now I have to also activate G mode again because that turns off. The gravel mode locks up the clutch faster for riding off-road. And the third thing I have to do, if I'm aggressively riding out here in the dirt, is I have to turn my traction control off. So it's gone back to setting number 1. I have to hold this down here, this tiny little button, which is kind of hard to do with gloves.
and back to 0, and now I'm ready to go. So this whole thing took me like 30 seconds every time I shut on and off the bike. There's no hard buttons like the old Africa Twin to do these functions. You can program the start button to be a favorite, but I have that set to the traction control so I can pull it up at any time and turn it up or down, and I'm going to keep it that way. But you can't use this to turn the traction control off and on. You have to use the touchscreen. They really messed this part up. They had it right on the old bike. I don't have a problem with the TFT. The TFT is great. Give me a TFT, but give me an easier way. Either make the bike remember the settings, like an off-road rally mode or something like, KTM has, or make it easier to turn them off, because going through this dance every single time is maddening, and honestly, it would keep me from buying this motorcycle. I love Africa Twins, right? I've had 2 of them.
So obviously we need to talk about how this bike compares to the competition, and how would you make a buying decision between this and all the other great adventure bikes on the market. So let's talk about this base bike for a second. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, the Africa Twin, especially now that it's an 1100, kind of slots somewhere in between the large adventure bikes and the small adventure bikes, and that can be a good or a bad thing depending on how you look at it. So if you look at the price of this bike, around $14,500 US compared to everything else out there, that really puts it in the range of something like KTM's 890 Adventure R, or maybe some of Triumph Tiger's 900, although they have different models of that bike. It is quite a bit below like a 1250 GS or KTM 1290, so it definitely comes in a lot below that. But here's one of the challenges I think that you have with the Africa Twin. It has a lot of the disadvantages of the smaller adventure bikes, and what I mean is that they're not as good for like long distance touring. So if you look at this bike, it's not a very comfortable seat. The windshield doesn't protect you very much. It doesn't have some of the touring amenities that you might want and that you might find on those larger bikes. But on the other hand, it's not as good off-road as KTM 890 or Tenere 700, those smaller adventure bikes, probably even as the Tiger 900, although I haven't tested that one yet. So I think it's a bit of a tough sell on this particular model, just because it kind of doesn't have the advantage of either class of bikes, the larger adventure bikes or the smaller adventure bikes. I hope that makes some sense. Now, if we're talking about the adventure sports version, which I hope to get to test soon, I think that might make more sense, because at around $17,000 to $18,000 for the adventure sports bike, that undercuts the GS and those bigger bikes by a lot of money, but you still get a lot of the cool features, heated grips, power sockets, adjustable windshields, electronic suspension, which is a huge thing, a lot of things like that. So I think that bike may make a lot more sense than the base model bike. Now, some of you might want to compare this to the V-Strom 1050. Well, I had the V-Strom 1050 on test, and you can go watch my video of that, and I hope you will. I would have this bike any day over the V-Strom 1050. I wasn't a huge fan of the 1050 V-Strom, and you can go watch that video for the reasons why. But at the same price, which they pretty much are, I would take this bike any day. This bike has tremendously more off-road capability than the V-Strom at about the same price, and I feel it has a higher quality and higher fit and finish, and it's also, I think, even better on the highway than the V-Strom as well. So again, I can't see any reason to buy the V-Strom over this. With all that being said, if I was buying a bike for all-around adventure riding, maybe a true 50-50 mix of off-road and on-road, this bike would still be very, very high on my list, just because of the build quality, the expected reliability, and just how solid this machine is and how you expect it to stand the test of time compared to the issues that we know the KTMs and other European bikes often do have. However, if I was thinking about getting this, I'd have to budget a pretty good chunk of money to totally upgrade the suspension, because like I mentioned, for off-roading, the suspension just is not going to cut it. Now, what about if you're thinking of upgrading from your older 1000cc Africa Twin, like a 2016 to 2019 bike? Well, I think you know my answer to that, because I've just bought a 2016 Africa Twin because I like that generation so much. The suspension wasn't quite as soft on those bikes. The seat was more comfortable. The control system and dashboard was much more simple to use. Although it does have a little bit less power and a little bit less tech, I just think that for an adventure bike for 50-50 type of use, that the 1000cc bike was better. And I think if you have that bike and you're happy with it, I don't really see any reason to upgrade to this, unless you like the Africa Twin, but you just need more power. Then I think, well, you're probably looking at upgrading to the 1100 and then working out some of the specific bugs of this model. So I really hope this review was useful for you. Again, I always ask for feedback on my reviews. Let me know how I'm doing. Let me know what you want me to change, what you want me to do differently, and I'll adjust my future reviews. Please stay tuned because I've got a lot more bike reviews coming. I've got the Pan America coming out. I've got the new KLR 650 in a few weeks. I've got the CRF1100L and a bunch more exciting stuff. So please stay tuned. I'm also getting a Tiger 900 Rally Pro. So a lot of stuff in the works. I hope that these reviews are, informative for all of you. If they are, please subscribe. Please always leave a comment. Please hit the thumbs up button, and please consider being a Patreon supporter. Thanks so much for watching. Ride safe, and we'll see you next time.